Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Season 3. I can't believe it. Can you believe it? I can't believe it. But I'm super psyched to be here. Super psyched that you're here. And we have a great season planned out for you already. I think you're going to love it. But before we get to our very first amazing guest, a little bit of housekeeping items. We completely redid the website, historynerdsunited.com. Head on over there. Let us know what you think. Also, let us know what you think about the podcast, right? Especially if you're on Apple or Spotify, you can give us 5-star reviews. I highly recommend the 5-star part. And that just helps us out a lot. You can also go on our Buzzsprout site or on historynerdsunited.com. There are options to subscribe or donate. Every little bit helps. If you even got a little bit of scratch lying around, we'd appreciate it. Enough of that. We were looking at all the guests that we had that we could use for episode 1, and one jumped out as just a no-brainer to me. Author Kim Cross, her book is In the Light of All Darkness. It's about the Polly Klaas Kidnapping in 1993, which, if you don't remember Polly's name, and a lot of people do, seriously, Google it. The picture's going to pop up, and you're going to be like, I remember this. It was a huge story. It was a big deal, and anyone from that time period will remember something about it. On top of that, Kim just writes an amazing book. She could have written about any story, and it would really be a fantastic read. But this one is especially good. It's true crime, and true crime can be sometimes a problematic genre, right? Because sometimes it's glorifying murderers, and it feels gross sometimes. Kim's book is the complete opposite. She talked to everybody she possibly could. She made sure to tell the whole story from everyone's perspective, except the killer, because forget that guy. And the book came out fantastic. I should add, she also has a personal connection to this story that could lead to some very awkward family dinners. That's my favorite little tidbit about this. I think that's enough. Why don't we hear from Kim? Let's bring her on. And here we are with author Kim Cross, In Light of All Darkness, Inside the Polly Klaas Kidnapping and the Search for America's Child. Kim, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Kim, before we dive into the book, because I vividly remember this case from when I was younger, I did some research on you. How often do you jump off of roofs into pools for research? How often does that happen?
As often as possible. I like to say that I'm a practitioner of immersion reporting. And for my last book, The Stall House, I had to jump off the roof of the stall house into the pool because the kids who grew up in the stall house, who are now adults, who wanted to tell the story of their house and their father's role in building it, were like, if you really want to know what it's like to grow up in the stall house, you've got to jump off the roof. And I was like, oh, twist my arm. When can I do it? So that was one of my favorite moments. And it turned out to be a great author photo as well.
Well, you seem, especially just from your Instagram alone, you seem to always be going, whether you're hiking or something like that. That's just kind of a Pacific Northwest thing, right? Like, you just got to be out there enjoying nature. It seems exhausting to me, but everybody else seems to enjoy it.
No, I like it. It's a wonderful foil to basically what I do for work, which is sitting in front of a screen, moving my hands all day. I think that sitting in a chair, they say sitting is the new smoking. And so I try to get out and balance out that with, jumping off of things or riding mountain bikes. And in my side hustle, I'm a trained mountain bike coach. And so that's a wonderful excuse to get away from my keyboard.
How well do I have to do in this interview to get on Kim's Whims, which I highly recommend everyone go to Kim's website and sign up for the newsletter called Kim's Whims. I just want to know how well I have to do today.
Oh, I don't know. You could get at least a 9 out of 10, but okay. I think you can do it. Okay. I believe in you.
I'm going to go for it. That would be award worthy. Hey, have you won any awards lately? Any awards you're going to go pick up in the next few months?
Well, in February, it's not announced yet, but I think I have permission to say that in February, the book is going to receive the Truman Capote Prize, which is a prize for a narrative-length nonfiction piece or short story in Alabama, or by an author related to Alabama. And I used to live in Alabama, so this book is going to get that prize. Very excited.
It's a big deal, and the book is fantastic. I remember just Polly Klaas, like that name is burned into my head. And I look back, I was only 11 when she was taken. What do you remember about Polly Klaas before you started writing the book and everything like that? Do you have it so vividly in your mind as I did?
I think so. And I feel like anyone who was at least 12 or older, old enough to, have parents who would worry when you were out of the house, I feel like most of us remember that case. I was 17 years old, junior in high school in North Florida, but I had lived in Santa Barbara when I was Polly's age. When I was 12, my parents let me walk all over that city by myself. I would walk 5 miles from my junior high to their office alone on an average weekday or evening, and it really didn't worry anybody that I was doing this. And of course, this was back in the day with no cell phones, no way of knowing where I was. And I do think that my childhood would have been really different if I had been 12 after this case.
I mean, it really was. I don't think, especially younger listeners, I have an 8-year-old. The thought of her walking anywhere without my eyes on her, just no way. Like, it's not even thought about. Somebody would call the cops if she looked like she was out, playing by herself. But I mean, that was, especially before this case, like this case, I think actually changed a lot from a society perspective, right?
Absolutely. I really believe it changed American childhood. And I've wondered if this didn't mark kind of the end of free-range childhood and the beginning of helicopter parenting, because it incited a lot of fear in parents. I mean, not unrightly so. You see this happen, you instantly think, that could be me, that could be my kid. The idea that Polly was not a kid engaging in at-risk behavior. She didn't hang out in sketchy places with sketchy people. She stuck pretty close to home. She was well parented, well supervised. She kind of might walk 1.5 blocks to the corner store to get milk or ice cream, but she didn't really roam a lot. And she had a good upbringing. So the idea that this kid can be at home in her bedroom, where if there's any place she should be safe, it's that place, with her friends, having a sleepover while her mom is asleep in the room next door, and that someone could come into the house, a total stranger, and just take her out. That is really unimaginable. And I think that a lot of people thought, oh my gosh, there but for the grace of God go I. We better keep a closer eye on our kids. We better change some things.
I mean, it is one of the strangest abduction stories you've ever heard. Like you just mentioned, 2 of her friends are there for sleepovers. They're in the same room when this guy comes in. And then I don't even remember the story that there was, a completely different set of people basically living in the backyard, and her mother is home. I've just never even seen any crime like this where a guy would just walk in, all of these people around in plain sight, and just take a girl. I mean, was there any precedent for something like this when it happened?
Well, yeah. I mean, if you think about it, the first really famous kidnapping was the Charles Lindbergh baby. And someone, with a ladder snuck into his bedroom and took him. I mean, that's a little different, that he didn't just walk into an unlocked door, but it was an example of someone being taken from the home. Elizabeth Smart, someone came into her bedroom and took her. So, I mean, that wasn't a precedent per se, but, it has happened. This isn't the only time it's happened. But there was something about this particular case that really just shocked America, that I think is why it stays with us and has stayed with us for 30 years.
And before we talk about the reaction and the investigation and everything, this is also a kind of a personal story for you, right? Because you do have a personal connection to this case. Can you talk about that real quick, your connection, and then also, as a nonfiction writer, is that very intimidating to walk into something like this and say, I have a personal connection, but I need to make sure that I'm staying impartial? Was there any concern about that for you when you started writing?
So my personal connection is that I'm the daughter-in-law of Eddie Fryer, who was the FBI case agent who supervised this case. This was a joint investigation between the FBI and Petaluma Police Department. And so Eddie introduced me to Val Bello, who was the original partner on that case from Petaluma. And then they started introducing me to other colleagues of theirs. And sooner or later, I realized that I had access to people who didn't normally talk to the press. And a lot of them started cleaning out their attics and giving me bankers' boxes of files that I could not have gotten as a journalist with even a Freedom of Information Act request. So I had this incredible access that I think it would have been hard for another journalist to get. And what's interesting is I've never been really a true crime consumer. I didn't really consume podcasts or books or shows about it. And so this was not my natural habitat as a writer. But when I realized that I had both the access and the skills as a narrative journalist to tell the story, then I started looking into, I did my homework. I like to do a little pre-reporting to decide, like, is this a story I want to tell? Do I have the resources to tell it? Is there a market for it? Does this make sense? So I started looking at the case and looking at what was written about it and realized there were only 2 books about it, and they had been written before the trial, and both were largely based on newspaper accounts, many of which had errors in them because they were, written on deadline in a situation that was unfolding with a lot of uncertainty and misinformation. And so I realized that, there wasn't a book of record about this case. And then I looked and thought, like, well, why would anyone care about this case 30 years later? And then I started learning that Eddie and some of the other investigators were still, after 30 years, using it as a case study to train generations of future investigators. Eddie let me sit in on a class he was teaching on interviewing and interrogation for the Behavioral Analysis Training Institute. And I realized, like, this whole case, he had teaching points for every step of this case. And the investigators in the room were rapt. They were all, young guns, kind of, on the early end of their career, but they were riveted. And I was shocked that a case this old was still this relevant and still had this many things to teach the modern day investigator who has different tools than they had back then. And so I thought, well, this is interesting. And the more I started reaching out to people like Tony Maxwell, who was the FBI evidence response team member who lifted the palm print from Polly's bedroom, I realized Tony hadn't really told his story. He had been on maybe one show, but he hadn't really told his story, and he was ready to tell the story. And I realized too that a lot of these guys were retirement age, and that, I wanted to tell the story while they were around to help me tell it. So it was a combination of, I think, realizing this was a historically significant case, but it also has a lot of teaching tools that can be useful to investigators. And the fact that those tools were just emerging and they were tested and proven in the case allows me to kind of go on these little historical asides to talk about, the development of the polygraph and how it is used in an investigation, and the development of, fluorescent powder and alternate light source, and how FBI didn't even own it because it was technology so new. And so I thought, this is, there are definitely deep and dark parts of the story, but there's a lot of really interesting history that could be told through this case that I think would be not only interesting to a true crime audience, but also I felt if it was written with empathy and the right focus and balance, it might actually make you a better, more informed, and more compassionate true crime reader. That was my hope.
But this is really risky for you, right? Because what happens if you start investigating, you realize Eddie screwed up along the way? I mean, that's going to make for a really awkward Thanksgiving dinner when the book comes out, right?
Well, we certainly did have some Meet the Fockers moments. Have you seen that movie?
Oh, yes.
There were a few moments along this way that I was totally Ben Stiller in Meet the Fockers. I stuck my foot in my mouth. Early on in the telling of this, when I went to sit in on Eddie's class, I noticed that he told them about one of the greatest mistakes of the case, in his words, and that was how Kate and Jillian, Polly's 12-year-old friends, were treated by investigators who were kind of suspicious because this sort of thing didn't really happen like this. People didn't walk in and take a kid out of an occupied house. And Kate and Jillian were interviewed at first, by detectives separately, but the interviews, they were interviewed again and again and submitted to polygraph tests, which wouldn't happen today. And the interviews increasingly became more like interrogations. So they were, treated as almost a suspect would be treated. And that was inappropriate for 12-year-old girls. And today we have child and adolescent forensic interviewers who are trained to interview child witnesses and victims in a way that is designed to minimize the re-traumatization of them. In those days, they didn't have those tools. And that was, one of the lessons learned that I thought would be beneficial in this story. But early on, I kind of said, Eddie, I can't pull any punches here. We're going to talk about the mistakes as well as the things that went right, because we learned from the mistakes as well as what went right. And he said, no, absolutely. But I was nervous when I had to talk about those things, that I didn't want to hurt anyone. And I tried to do it with empathy and context that could explain, for example, another example of a a thing that didn't go right was on the night of Polly's abduction, Sonoma Sheriff's deputies responded to a trespassing call about an hour away from Polly's house on a dark and wooded driveway where there was a man who had gotten stuck in a ditch. And the woman who owned the property came home and let her babysitter off. The babysitter encountered this stuck car and the kid, the man who turned out to be the kidnapper, and then they called the cops. At that point, all they knew was he was a trespasser. And so when the deputies responded, it was a trespassing call. They didn't have the be on the lookout alert, the All Points bulletin that said there's been a kidnapping. They didn't have information to connect with him being a potential suspect in a kidnapping. So after a 38-minute encounter, they let him go. Those deputies were excoriated in the press afterwards and judged kind of unfairly by people who didn't have all the information, such as there were legal constraints that prevented them from being able to arrest him because, to their knowledge, he hadn't committed a crime. So they could not arrest him, even though he was trespassing.
I want to get to the actual, physical science part of this, but especially those soft sciences. Talking and interviewing Polly's friends who were there that night. It's almost a secondary crime how badly it went. And you feel, because of course the police just didn't know what to do, right? Especially the local area. This was not something that was happening every other day. I mean, there's no other way to say it. They completely screwed up the interview with Polly's friends, who were the best eyewitnesses that night, right?
They were grasping for any tool that they had because they were so desperate, feeling the ticking clock, and the longer the time elapses after the kidnapping, the lower the chances of recovering the child alive. So they were desperate, and they were doing everything they could. And they reached in their toolbox and they brought out a hammer and they hammered the girls. And I mean, they didn't mean to rough them up, but they, I think, just didn't realize what they were doing, and so it caused a lot of trauma. I guess I'll say one of the most important and profound parts of reporting this book for me as a journalist was getting to talk to Kate and Jillian about that experience. I don't think that story had been told, and I was very nervous about reaching out to them because I didn't want to cause yet another layer of trauma. And so when I did make contact, I offered them whatever degree of agency they wanted. If they wanted to I could just read what I had written based on, the primary sources that I found, and they could help me fact check it and know what's going in the book. I didn't have to interview them, but if they wanted to offer information and add to that, they could. And so I wanted to give them agency and control over the interview. And I want to just praise Jillian for being not only willing, but going out of her way to help me check the facts and get it right. She caught a couple things that were wrong, but also gave me a lot of insight and context and nuance that I don't think it would have been possible to have without hearing it from her and hearing what she remembered and being able to see it through her eyes and also know the longer range impact of how they were treated and what they went through. Kate was really traumatized by this, and I have promised her that I will minimize talking about her, but I also want to just say I was really grateful because she helped in her own way and really helped me understand as a journalist how much trauma can be caused by not being trusted, by being treated a certain way, and how I think when journalists approach someone who's been through that without, and any concern for their well-being, and the fact that at every step I was aware that I could cause harm, even with good intentions, I could cause harm. And my whole mantra through this thing was maximize truth, minimize harm, maximize truth, minimize harm. How can I tell the story without causing more harm? And Kate really taught me a lot about that I think made me a better journalist and a better human. But she did ask me to not talk about her adult life, so I'll stop there. But they did both allow me to say that they're both doing okay. And that gives me really a lot of hope for other child victims who go through something awful, that, if they could go through that and be upstanding, great members of society, pretty darn okay, then that should give other victims hope.
Your care with the two of them is not where it ends for you as far as the respect that this book has. And I mean, before we hit record, I had said to you that true crime can just simply say it. True crime sometimes becomes just murder porn, right? And that's a really big, there's a backlash to true crime out there where it's reveling in the actual murderer, reveling in, the gory details and things. And I really think it comes through in this book that you are trying to focus on the people that matter as opposed to the piece of garbage who we don't even need to name, especially even Polly's mother. Like you really take the time that you will say things, not necessarily criticizing her, but you'll point out things that maybe, hey, this made people have questions and things like that. But there was a lot of care going into making sure you're telling the whole story and that everyone, they get to shine in their own way. They get to be understood in a certain way. Did you feel that from the start that, like you were saying, as least harm as possible? Is that something you go in and you're like, I don't want to just add another true crime book that's just more murder porn?
Absolutely. I was so worried about just the fact that these stories can exploit, other people's pain. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to tell a story that would be painful, but would also teach and provide something hopeful, something redemptive, and lessons that I truly believe can go on and save other kids. In order to do that, you need to know some of the details, but not all of the gory details. And so I was very, very judicious and tossed and turned a lot about what details to include. There was a lot that I left out because I didn't want to include anything gratuitous. But there were some things that were necessarily specific, and there was a graphic nature to that specificity, but I felt the reader needed to understand. And I'm just talking about like one paragraph, and felt like one of the things that the prosecutors were unable to do in court is convict him of sexual assault. And that is the one thing that he seemed to care the most about getting off the hook for. That's the thing that he, maintained he didn't do in all the interviews. And having been to prison many times, I think that he probably knew that there's a pecking order in prison and child molesters are kind of at the bottom of it. And so I think that there was some self-interest there. And so I felt like in order for this to be an honest book, he needed to be held accountable and to be held properly accountable by the reader, who could then come to their own conclusion. They needed to know specific details about how her body was positioned and how the clothing on her body was positioned. But I really agonized for months and wept and consulted many, many, many writers and, agonized over how can I do this without being disrespectful? Like if this was my child, what image would I not want a stranger to see? But then I thought if this was my child, I would want the person who did this to my child to be fully accountable. And for that to happen, I would want, people to know what he did. And so there was one paragraph in there that was really, really hard to write. And you can get there and you'll see what it is.
Yeah, and I'm thinking exactly of it, and we don't need to dive into it. You can read it. But what I really liked about that, too, is reading that I could see that you backed away from that, and then instead of focusing on that, you focused on the people who found that spot. And people will know when you read the book that what was their reaction to it, as opposed to having those terrible details and just being gory about it. You let the people who were there, who experienced it, let them talk about what they were feeling and what they were thinking of doing possibly at that point in time.
Yeah, I really wanted you to see through the point of view of the investigators who worked really hard around the clock, foregoing sleep, foregoing time with family for months, 2 months, really, to try to find her, and to try to bring her home alive. They all had a tremendous emotional response. And, I interviewed like 50 FBI agents or detectives for this book. And I would say about half of them cried. And so I wanted you to feel that emotion, how much they cared and how upset they were that they didn't find her the way they wanted to find her, which was alive. So when I wrote that scene, I tried to put the camera, the GoPro on them so that you could see, in their heads and see what they were feeling.
How do you, as a writer, you're digging into, this darkness. How do you keep yourself sane? I mean, for me, I know if I watch a particularly bad true crime show, I'll be like, we got to watch comedy next. I need a break. That was heavy. Like, that was good. It was informative, all these things. But I'm like, we got to put on something else that's just not like this because it gets heavy. And you're immersed in it. How do you, as an author, keep your own head above water?
Well, thanks for asking that. I mean, I want to say that nothing I felt or went through even comes close to what Polly's family and friends went through. So I feel even a little guilty about talking about my pain when their pain is so much greater. But I will say that this book took me to some of the darkest places I've been as a writer. And I was really under the gun to meet the deadline. And I locked myself in a beautiful cabin, not like a misery cabin, but a beautiful loaned cabin in the woods for weeks on end, where I would work from like 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. with a short break in the middle of the day to go for a snowshoe or, ride my bike. And it literally did some damage, I think, physically and mentally. And it sort of came out later when I was getting ready to put the book into the world that week. I woke up and thought I had COVID, and I went to the urgent care and said, yeah, I feel like I have COVID, and I'm also feeling shortness of breath and chest pressure. And they sent me straight to the ER, where I spent the weekends in heart attack mode. I was not having a heart attack, but my body literally kind of revolted, I think. There were times when I wrote through nausea and when I would just feel physically ill. I don't know. This is not like any other book I've ever written. It was really hard. It's still kind of hard knowing it's out in the world and it's going to do whatever it's going to do. And knowing that, true crime can bring out conspiracy theorists and can attract strange people. And so I feel a little bit, constantly on edge. So I don't know. It's a different genre for me.
Well, I'm going to turn it a little bit. Let's go a little bit positive for a second, because again, this is very heavy, but I feel like I could tell that there was one section of this book where you fully were like, this is fun. And that's the CSI nerd stuff during the investigation. As you starting to feel, I'm like, Kim's having a great time talking about this part. This part is fun. Am I right? Did I pick up on it properly?
Yes. I love learning new stuff. I love learning how things work. I love little historical asides. One of the hard things about this book was I had to really subdue my own authorial voice, which I think when I'm at my best is kind of bemused, right? There was no place in this book to be bemused. I think there was one part in this book where I'm bemused, and it was when I'm talking about the inventor of the polygraph machine. And he also happened to be more well known as the cartoonist who invented the character Wonder Woman, whose weapon is
lasso of truth.
Right. And I thought that was so wonderful. But I did really enjoy learning about it, learning about how fluorescent powder and alternate light source worked, and how it was kind of still being tested, and how Tony Maxwell would take it home with him and practice in his living room where his wife ran a daycare, and there were little kids' body fluids and fingerprints all over the place. And, there were really fun little moments in that, and how one of the polygraphers, Ron Hilly, would take his unit home and practice on his daughters and say, if I'm going to hide a jar of money in the house, and if I can't find it through this polygraph test, then you get to have it. And they never got to keep the money because he always found it. And I don't know, all of those things, I think it was the history and the science combined with the personal stories. That was really fun. And I felt provided some emotional pacing to what otherwise is a very intense, very heavy story.
And that all fell under the umbrella, and it's at the very beginning of the book, is Locard's exchange principle, right? Can you just talk about that real quick? I mean, because that's, you started and just, you see the footprints of it throughout. What is Locard's exchange principle?
Can I read it?
Sure.
Locard's exchange principle. Every contact leaves a trace. And that's from Edmund Locard in 1934. But Paul Leland Kirk wrote something afterwards, and he was a criminologist who wrote this around 1953. Wherever he steps, whatever he touches, whatever he leaves, even unconsciously, will serve as a silent witness against him. Not only his fingerprints and his shoe prints, but also his hair, the fibers from his clothes, the glass he breaks, the tool mark he leaves, the paint he scratches, the blood or semen he deposits or collects. All of these and more bear mute witness against him. This is evidence that does not forget. It is not confused by the excitement of the moment. It is not absent because human witnesses are. Physical evidence cannot be wrong. It cannot perjure itself. It cannot be wholly absent. Only in its interpretation can there be error. Only human failure to find, study, and understand it can diminish its value. And I felt like that passage was really applicable to this book because memory came into play, and the way people remember when they are influenced by trauma is really interesting and is not like a video camera. And so I thought, this is a great lens through which to see this story.
Especially because the physical evidence is so important because, as we talked about, you had two witnesses that were mishandled, right? You have various other family entanglements that kind of make these things more complicated. And as we talked about, and it's kind of a bigger question, all right? So I'm saying there's a lot of CSI here before we knew CSI type things. Is that one of the reasons that this became what it became? I mean, once again, I think about if that picture of Polly Klaas I hadn't seen in decades. But this book comes up, you see that picture, it's her, she's got the flower top on and everything like that, and you're like, I haven't seen that in 20 years, that's Polly Klaas. Why did this case, of all cases, just go right through the United States and cause the groundswell, the chaos, the worry? Like, what made it so emotional for this country, this particular case?
That's a great question. I think it's because Polly reminded everyone of someone that they loved and cared about. Whether it was a daughter, a sister, a niece, a friend, she was America's child. That term was coined by one of the volunteers, Joanne Gardner, who knew that if she could keep the media engaged, that the media would then ensure leads would come in from the public. And that was really instrumental to this case. So when I think about why this case matters, it was really a time when there was this perfect storm between the media, the volunteer effort, and the investigators. 4,000 volunteers came out of the woodwork to literally walk through woods, look in old barns, walk down by the river, go into the woods to look for Polly. Or they would go out and, go on their skateboard and tack up flyers. Something like 8 million flyers were distributed as far as China. And I think it was this time when people thought, like, not in our town. We can do this, and if we only, look hard enough and work hard enough and work together, we will beat this evil. And that's a beautiful thing to see in a community. They really came together. Meanwhile, the investigators went for 2 months where they really didn't have any good leads. In a case like this, a kidnapping is different, forensically speaking, from a murder scene. With a murder, you've got a body, you've got a weapon, you've got blood spatters, you've got the murder scene. You've got a lot of evidence. With a kidnapping, you have an absence. You have trace evidence, hairs and fibers and fingerprints, especially if there is no obvious tie to the perpetrator, as there is in many kidnapping cases where it's a custody dispute or it's someone who knows the child. They couldn't find any tie to anyone who could have taken Polly. They were chasing a ghost. So they were really reliant on the tips coming in from the public, hoping that someone had seen someone who looked like the composite sketch that was distributed, or the second composite sketch, which was better. And it was one of those public tips that eventually led to the break in the case.
What I really appreciate you doing in this book, too, is it would be very easy to leave the answer there. But you take it one step further and you just point out that, yes, this is a middle-class young girl who gets taken and gets a lot of media attention. And that's not necessarily true of all kids that get taken. What do you say to that, right? When people's like, well, of course, she got a lot of attention. She's a middle-class white girl. There's a lot of people who would have a problem with that and even doing a book about it again. What do you have to say to that?
Right. There's a phenomenon known as missing white woman syndrome that acknowledges the tendency of the press to cover women, white, victims who are of a certain demographic. And then I started thinking about it and realized that most of the missing kids who we know on a household name basis are middle class, white, attractive, and most of them are girls. And kids who are, people of color, they don't get the same attention that Polly got. And so I was really concerned that a book like this could actually contribute to missing white woman syndrome. So I felt like it was important to acknowledge it. My editor felt that was important. And I want to give kudos to Jillian and Kate again, because they were the ones who brought my attention to a girl who was kidnapped in Petaluma a few years after Polly. Her name was Georgia Lee Moses, and she didn't get the treatment that Polly got. Georgia Lee was kidnapped under different circumstances, and her body was found before she was even reported missing. And as someone pointed out to me, communities don't search for kidnappers. They search for missing kids who they hope are still alive. But still, I couldn't believe that that was the first time I had heard the name Georgia Lee Moses. And then I learned that Tom Waits had written a song about her. And then I learned that her sister is still searching for her kidnapper all these years later. It hurt my heart to think that in this town that had done so much to find Polly was the same place where, Georgia Lee, Moses' sister, is still looking for her kidnapper.
From your research, what stuck out to you about Polly that we should remember about her as a person as opposed to a case?
Well, she is often portrayed as, this very beautiful, very spunky kid who was also afraid of the dark and afraid of strangers. She was really on the cusp of graduating from cute into beautiful. She was really on that cusp of adolescence and coming into herself. She was a shy kid, but because she had discovered acting, her shyness kind of melted away on stage. And she could be sassy and funny. And as Jillian shared with me, she could do a really funny Elvis impersonation, which I loved. And she had, gone to a dance with a boy and had her first kiss. I don't know if that's ever been reported, but Jillian shared that with me. And it just makes me feel this story deep in my heart to think like we've all been where Polly was at that age when your whole life is stretching in front of you and it's endless possibilities and you're figuring out what you're good at and you're figuring out who your friends are and where you fit into this school and junior high. And she was learning how to pick out her own clothes. Like up until that point, she liked her mom, Eve, to pick out her outfits, but her mom had taken her shopping and she took great relish that fall in picking out her own wardrobe. I don't know. I just feel like she awakens in me that same feeling of, gosh, yeah, I feel like I know someone like her. She reminds me of someone I know, even maybe ourselves. To think that, a life cut short like that is so sad, right? But I also want people to understand that she changed the world in her 12 years more than most people can hope to in a lifetime. She is remembered deeply by so many people who tear up when they talk about her. She mattered and continues to matter to a lot of people. And I really hope that through this book, she can continue helping people. At the end of the book, I don't want to spoil the ending, but I want to promise that there is I don't want to say a happy ending, but a really poignant, meaningful ending that is not sad. And it concerns a girl who was kidnapped at knife point from her house by a total stranger just a few months after Polly. And because of what the investigators had learned from this investigation, and because of the efforts they made to share it with other investigators in the case debriefing, this other girl had a very different fate. And I am excited for you to meet her as a reader. And I was really, really touched that she and the police chief who rescued her were able to be at my book launch in Petaluma. We had a ticketed event where we had 20 of the characters from the book come on stage, and I got to guide them through telling their story to an audience of about 200 people. And the ticket sales all raised money for the Polly Klaas Foundation. And then we had some other events, and we had a donation from one of the children of one of the agents who passed away during the reporting of this book. We lost two, but I got to interview them before they died, and I got to capture their stories, and I got to give their interviews back to their families. Well, the daughter of Lillian Zilius, who supervised the evidence response team, decided that instead of the cost of a funeral, she and her father wanted to donate that money instead of the Polly Klaas Foundation. So they donated $10,000. So in all, the events raised at least $12,000 for the Polly Klaas Foundation, which is a rare nonprofit founded in the wake of a tragedy like this that is still going strong after 30 years. And it's really neat because it's again, part of Polly's legacy is that they've been helping and supporting the families of 10,000 missing people over the past 30 years. And because the caseload is going down, hopefully because there's either more resources elsewhere or less of a desperate need, they are actually pivoting to teach classes that they hope will prevent kids from going missing in the first place. So they will come to your school and teach internet safety classes for a very, very low cost. So I hope readers will, take an interest in the Polly Klaas Foundation, go to the website, check it out, consider donation, or consider bringing them to your school. Because part of the, thing we can do about kidnapping is educate kids so that they're, less likely to become victims.
I have one more question for you, Kim, and I know you're prepared for it. So I ask every author, it's the same thing. I'm going to shorten the question so that you can fully go off on it. There are people who don't like history. Why should they read your book? Tell them now. Okay,
so if you don't like history, if you think history is boring, I was you. I was you. In high school, I hated history. Oh, gosh. I got 2 Bs in high school, and one of them was in history because I just hated having to memorize facts and dates that I thought, when will this ever be useful to me? Then I realized that history is a story. It can be told as a story, and that stories can actually, teach us things about ourselves and about the world that we're living in. Stories are really empathy machines. And I think that, if you look at history that way, if you approach history that way, it can be really engaging. It can have something to do with you, and it can give you a lot of perspective, and we can learn things from it that make us better people and hopefully, help us avoid repeating mistakes. When I was in grad school, I got to take a history class where I had to be a historian. And I realized as a journalist, I'm just reporting from sources who are dead. And it was really fun. And I remember writing my paper and writing my lead just like a scene with action and stuff. And my history professor was just so taken with it. And he said, you should pitch this to conferences. And I'm like, but I don't want to be a historian. I want to be a journalist and a storyteller. So I guess I would say that I try for most of my books to be a narrative where you are caught in the story, you're embedded in the story, you're living it through the characters. But then every once in a while you pause and there's a little aside where you get to learn something. My hope is that, you're caught in this current of the story. And then just when you need a little bit of a break and a breather, you get to learn something about something that I think is kind of interesting. And it matters to what happens next in the story. And then you get swept away in the story again. So that's what my hope is. And if you give it a shot, if you do happen to be a historian or a journalist, you might enjoy the 50 pages of footnotes that almost killed me. But I also tried to write the footnotes as a story. So I tried to write them with a narrative that says, here's how this chapter came together. Here's how I reported this chapter. This is where the dialogue came from. This is how I reconstructed this scene. Here's a discrepancy where 2 sources saw the same thing happen but perceived different things. And so if you like knowing like the sausage making of how things get done, I hope the footnotes are worth reading as well.
Well, Kim, I think you nailed it on all counts. The book is fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. It was fun.
And that's it for this episode. Kim, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. In the light of all darkness, get this book. It is so good. Trust me on that. In the meantime, hit us up. Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Go to the new site. Let us know what you think. If it's not perfect, we want to hear about it. And if it is perfect, we definitely want to hear you say that too. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.
History Nerds United.